The image of the sniper is one of modern warfare's most enduring archetypes. A lone hunter, a ghost cloaked in camouflage, capable of changing the course of a battle with a single, perfectly placed shot. We envision a master of stealth, moving unseen through forests and fields, a patient predator holding life and death in the balance from 1,000 yards. But the brutal reality of the First World War systematically dismantled this romantic notion. For the marksman of the Great War, the battlefield was not a vast wilderness offering endless concealment, but a static, meticulously observed prison of mud and steel. Welcome to Medieval Nocturnes. If you enjoy deep dives into the grim realities of history, consider subscribing to our channel for more content designed for thoughtful listening. The fundamental curse for the World War I sniper was the nature of the Western Front itself. Unlike the fluid, mobile conflicts that preceded and followed it, trench warfare was an exercise in brutal stagnation. For months, and sometimes years, the lines barely moved, locking millions of men into a fixed landscape of interwoven trenches, shell craters, and shattered earth. This static environment created a paradox for the marksman. While his role demanded concealment and surprise, the unchanging battlefield ensured that every feature, every potential hiding spot, became intimately known to the enemy watching from just a few hundred yards away across the desolate expanse of no man's land. This intimate familiarity transformed the battlefield into a catalogued death trap. Every broken tree, every collapsed farmhouse, every shell hole deep enough to hide a man was noted, mapped, and indexed by enemy observers. A position that offered a commanding field of fire on a Monday, such as a church bell tower overlooking the German lines, would be meticulously recorded by observers equipped with powerful Zeiss optics. By Wednesday, that same tower would be pre-registered by enemy artillery and counter-sniper teams, ready to unleash a torrent of fire on anyone foolish enough to occupy it a second time. Every advantage was temporary, and every success painted a target on your back. The very rhythm of life in the trenches worked against the sniper's need for anonymity. Trench warfare operated on a rigid, predictable schedule. The daily stand-to at dawn and dusk, the precise timing of ration parties, the regular rotation of sentries. These routines were quickly learned by the enemy. An experienced German observer knew that British snipers were often most active during the morning mist, just as his British counterpart knew to watch for German movement during the evening twilight. This predictability allowed counter-sniper teams to prepare ambushes with chilling precision, lying in wait for their quarry to appear during these known windows of activity. Compounding these tactical disadvantages were the profound technological limitations of the era's weaponry. A modern sniper would be horrified by the equipment his Great War predecessor was forced to use. The standard issue rifles, whether a British Lee Enfield, a German Mauser, or a French Lebel, all fired cartridges propelled by cordite. With every shot, these rifles produced a massive cloud of dense white smoke. This signature, combined with a brilliant muzzle flash, acted as an unmistakable beacon, instantly announcing the sniper's exact position to every enemy observer for a mile in every direction. The perpetually damp and misty conditions of the Western Front exacerbated the problem of powder smoke to a lethal degree. On a clear, windy day, the smoke might dissipate quickly, but in the morning fog or persistent drizzle that characterized Flanders and the Somme, the heavy cordite smoke would linger, hanging in the air around the firing position for several minutes. It stood out as a stark white plume against the grim, gray-brown landscape, a lingering signal that allowed enemy spotters to track its origin with mathematical precision and coordinate a deadly response. Even more immediate than the smoke was the danger of the muzzle flash. The bright orange-red flame that erupted from the rifle's barrel was easily visible for hundreds of yards, even in broad daylight. In the low-light conditions of dawn or dusk, or during the dead of night, it became a death sentence. Enemy marksmen developed techniques specifically to exploit this weakness, pre-sighting their own rifles on likely sniper positions and simply waiting for the telltale flash to provide them with an instantaneous target. The very act of firing your weapon was an invitation for a bullet in return. The core of a sniper's craft is patience. It demands hours of motionless observation, studying enemy lines through a telescopic sight, waiting for the briefest glimpse of a high-value target. This prolonged stillness, however, created a profound vulnerability in the static environment of the trenches. Remaining stationary in a forward position for hours on end, from the cold light of dawn to the fading gloom of dusk, turned these marksmen into sitting targets for the most indiscriminate killer of the Great War: artillery. German artillery doctrine, in particular, emphasized the systematic suppression of any known or suspected enemy observation posts. Their observers kept meticulous records of Allied sniper activity, noting every position that showed the faintest sign of use. These locations were then prioritized for harassing fire, a chillingly casual term for precisely timed bombardments, designed to catch soldiers in their most vulnerable moments. A sniper who had spent 6 grueling hours stalking an enemy officer might find his world erupting in fire and steel, just as he prepared to take the shot. The nature of high-explosive shells made this threat especially lethal for the isolated sniper. Infantrymen in the main trenches could seek relative safety in deep dugouts or reinforced concrete shelters. But snipers in their forward hides rarely had such protection. The very positions that offered the best fields of fire, shallow shell holes, abandoned farm buildings, or hastily dug scrapes, also left them terribly exposed to the deadly rain of metal from an artillery barrage. Even a near miss could be fatal, as shrapnel and shell fragments could retain lethal velocity for hundreds of yards from the point of impact. An even more insidious and terrifying threat was poison gas. The chemical agents used in World War I, such as chlorine and phosgene, were heavier than air. This meant they would sink and settle into the very low-lying areas that snipers favored for concealment, like shell craters and ditches. An infantryman in the main line would receive warning from sentries or alarm systems, giving him precious seconds to don his gas mask. The isolated sniper, however, might have no warning at all, realizing he was under attack only when the gas had already reached a lethal concentration around him. Surviving the initial gas cloud was only half the battle. The primitive gas masks of the era were a nightmare for a marksman. They severely restricted vision, with eyepieces that would fog over almost immediately, rendering the sniper effectively blind. Attempting to aim a rifle with any precision was nearly impossible. This forced a terrible choice: remove the mask to engage a target and face almost certain death from gas inhalation, or remain helpless, fumbling with a rifle that was now useless in your hands. Wind, the sniper's constant and unpredictable adversary, added another layer of danger. The prevailing westerly winds on the Western Front meant that gas released by the Germans against Allied lines could drift back across no man's land. A chemical attack aimed at the trenches a quarter-mile away could silently find its way into the forward observation post of a sniper who believed himself safe from the main assault. The gas would linger in these depressions for hours, creating invisible death traps for any unwary soldier moving through the area long after the initial attack had passed. This profound isolation defined the sniper's existence. Unlike an infantryman who could retreat through a network of communication trenches, the sniper in no man's land often had no viable escape route. The same shell-pocked terrain that offered him concealment also acted as a barrier to any rapid withdrawal. A deep shell crater provided excellent cover from small arms fire, but its steep, muddy sides could make a quick escape impossible if the position was suddenly overrun by an enemy raiding party, leaving the sniper cornered and facing overwhelming odds. The psychological burden of isolation and the ever-present threat of a counter-sniper's bullet were compounded by a more fundamental problem: the shocking inadequacy of the equipment snipers were issued. While military leaders spoke of the tactical advantages of precision marksmanship, the reality on the ground revealed a deep disconnect between ambition and capability. The rifles, optics, ammunition, and camouflage available in 1914 were products of peacetime assumptions about warfare, and they proved catastrophically unfit for the industrial slaughter of the Western Front. Most armies entered the war without a dedicated sniper rifle. Instead, they took standard-issue infantry weapons and hastily modified them by adding commercially available hunting scopes. The British short magazine Lee Enfield, the SMLE, was a legendary infantry rifle, renowned for its reliability and rapid rate of fire. However, it was never designed for precision at extended ranges. Its bolt action, while robust, lacked the tight tolerances needed for consistent accuracy beyond 400 yards, and its heavy, inconsistent trigger pull made a clean, surprising shot release exceptionally difficult. Their German counterparts initially fared little better with their Mauser Guhar 98 rifles. While the Mauser action was mechanically stronger and inherently more accurate than the Lee Enfield, the standard infantry version suffered from the same core issue. These weapons were engineered for volume of fire by massed infantry, not the delicate, deliberate work of a sniper. The barrels were manufactured with tolerances that prioritized durability and ease of mass production over the pinpoint consistency required for long-range marksmanship. The French Lebel rifle presented even greater challenges. Its revolutionary at-the-time tube magazine, which ran through the rifle's forestock, created significant balance problems when a heavy telescopic sight was mounted on top. The rifle was also incredibly long, making it unwieldy and difficult to maneuver within the cramped confines of a trench. Furthermore, its powerful 8mm cartridge produced an enormous muzzle blast and flash, creating a prominent signature that was a gift to any enemy observer watching the line. Perhaps the most glaring weakness in the early sniper's arsenal was the telescopic sight itself. At the outbreak of war, most armies had no standardized military-grade scope. Snipers were issued a chaotic hodgepodge of civilian hunting scopes, repurposed naval telescopes, and crudely manufactured military optics that had never been tested under combat conditions. This complete lack of standardization created a logistical nightmare for maintenance and repair, and a practical nightmare for the men who had to rely on them. The Aldous scope, which became a common optic for British snipers, exemplified the problem. Designed for civilian target shooting, its internal mechanisms were far too delicate to withstand the repeated shock of rifle recoil, let alone the earth-shattering concussion from a nearby artillery barrage. Its mounting system, Often, a simple clamp arrangement would frequently loosen under field conditions. A sniper could spend hours carefully zeroing his rifle at a base camp, only to find it completely inaccurate after a single day of being jostled around in the trenches. Even the much vaunted German optical equipment, while generally superior in quality, suffered from similar fundamental flaws. The superb Zeiss and Gors scopes used by German snipers were marvels of peacetime engineering. Originally developed for scientific work like astronomical observation and land surveying, their complex internal workings were vulnerable to shock, and the slightest bit of moisture entering the scope body could fog the internal lenses for days, rendering the instrument completely useless in the damp European climate. The mounting systems used to attach these fragile scopes to the rifles created a constant battle for consistency. Early designs, relying on simple dovetail rails or clamp arrangements, had been sufficient for a gentleman hunter in the Scottish Highlands, but they proved utterly inadequate for military service. The constant shock of firing, combined with the rough handling a rifle inevitably received in the mud and chaos of the trenches, caused these mounts to work loose or shift their position. A sniper could begin his day with a perfectly zeroed weapon and end it with a rifle that couldn't hit a barn door, his scope having moved several inches from its original alignment after a nearby artillery bombardment. The optical quality of the lenses themselves presented a different but equally deadly problem. Most early telescopic sights featured lenses that were single-coated or, in many cases, completely uncoated. This meant they reflected a significant amount of ambient light, creating a bright glint or flash that could be seen by an enemy observer at considerable distances. German counter-sniper teams quickly became adept at scanning the opposing lines for this telltale glint of sunlight off a lens. For many Allied snipers, the very tool that gave them superior vision also served as their death warrant, betraying their position with a single, fleeting flash. Fogging was another persistent plague that haunted the optics of the Great War. The temperature difference between the warm interior of a scope and the cold, damp air of a Flanders morning would cause condensation to form instantly on both the internal and external lens surfaces. Moving from the relative warmth of a dugout into a cold firing position could render a scope completely useless within minutes. This problem was especially acute during the winter, where temperature differences of 30 degrees or more were common, turning a precision instrument into a useless, fog-blinded tube of metal and glass. Even when the scopes were clear and securely mounted, their adjustment mechanisms lacked the precision and durability required for military service. Most featured crude adjustment knobs that moved the point of impact in large, clumsy increments, making fine adjustments for range or wind impossible. A single click of an elevation knob might shift the bullet's impact by 4 inches at 300 yards, forcing the sniper to aim either slightly high or slightly low, with no hope of true precision. The delicate mechanical linkages that connected these knobs to the internal lenses were also notoriously fragile and frequently broke under field conditions. Ammunition quality presented an equally severe challenge to the science of marksmanship. The immense demand for cartridges necessitated mass production on an unprecedented scale, which inevitably led to significant variations in quality control. The British .303 ammunition, for instance, showed powder charge variations of up to 15% between individual cartridges from the same box. This created wildly unpredictable changes in muzzle velocity, which in turn translated into dramatic differences in the bullet's trajectory. A sniper who had perfectly calculated the holdover for a 600-yard shot might see his bullet strike 2 feet high or low, simply due to ammunition inconsistency. The cordite propellant used in British ammunition was a problem in itself, even beyond the smoke it produced. Cordite's burning characteristics were highly sensitive to temperature and humidity, adding yet another layer of unpredictability. Cartridges that had been stored in a damp section of trench might produce a muzzle velocity 200 feet per second lower than identical cartridges kept dry in a soldier's pack. This variance was enough to completely alter the bullet's flight path, forcing snipers to learn the dark art of segregating their ammunition based on its exposure to the elements and adjusting their aim accordingly. German ammunition was generally more consistent, but quality control suffered greatly as the war dragged on and strategic resources became scarce. By 1917, the 7.92 mm Mauser cartridge showed increasing variations in bullet weight and powder charge. Bullets were being manufactured from inferior metals with inconsistent jacket thicknesses, leading to erratic flight characteristics that made true long-range accuracy a matter of luck as much as skill. The sniper was a craftsman forced to work with flawed materials, where every shot was a gamble against the failings of his own supply chain. The bullets themselves imposed their own fundamental limitations on the sniper's effectiveness. Military ammunition of the era featured full metal jacket projectiles, a design mandated by the Hague Conventions to limit unnecessary suffering. While effective for their intended purpose in infantry combat, these bullets lacked the aerodynamic properties needed for consistent long-range accuracy. Their blunt, rounded nose design was far less stable in flight than the pointed boat tail or hollow point bullets used by civilian target shooters, causing them to lose velocity rapidly and become highly susceptible to wind drift. Primer quality represented another, more subtle source of inconsistency that plagued the marksman. The small percussion cap at the base of the cartridge, responsible for igniting the main powder charge, showed significant variations in sensitivity and burn rate. These minute differences would alter the pressure curve inside the chamber as the round was fired, leading to small but critical changes in muzzle velocity. An experienced sniper learned to develop an ear for the sound of his rifle, listening for the subtle crack of a good round versus the duller boom of one with a subpar primer. Ultimately, snipers were forced to work with standard infantry cartridges that had been designed for an entirely different purpose. This ammunition prioritized reliability in machine guns and rapid-fire infantry volleys over the single-shot precision required for sniping. The manufacturing tolerances were adequate for creating a beaten zone to suppress an area target, but they were woefully insufficient for hitting a man-sized target at over 400 yards. A rifle and ammunition combination that could group shots within 6 inches at 100 yards might produce a spread of 2 feet or more at tactically significant ranges. The techniques for camouflage and concealment available to the World War I sniper were equally primitive, reflecting a military mindset that was only just beginning to grasp the importance of battlefield invisibility. Most armies marched to war in 1914 wearing uniforms of a single, solid color, while British khaki, German field gray, and French horizon blue were vast improvements over the bright reds and blues of the 19th century. They still created a distinct, uniform silhouette that stood out plainly against the varied textures and colors of the Western Front. The concept of disruptive camouflage patterns had not yet been fully developed, forcing snipers to rely on improvised measures. They learned to gather local vegetation, grass, leaves, and branches, and attach it to their uniforms and positions to break up their outline. But this natural camouflage had a very short lifespan. It had to be constantly replaced as it wilted, dried out, and changed color. A sniper who had meticulously concealed himself in the morning dew might find his hide completely compromised by the afternoon sun as his green foliage turned brown and brittle. Face camouflage was rudimentary at best, often consisting of little more than theatrical grease paint or an improvised mixture of mud, charcoal, and cooking grease. These primitive solutions created more problems than they solved. The makeup would run and smear with sweat or rain, while mud-based paints would dry, crack, and flake off, leaving pale patches of skin that would glow like beacons to an observant enemy. Without proper non-reflective paint, a soldier's face often remained the most visible and easily identifiable part of his position. The standard military equipment of the day was a constellation of reflective surfaces that constantly threatened to betray a sniper's location. The polished metal bolt and oiled barrel of a rifle would catch the sun, creating a glint of light visible from hundreds of yards away. Snipers desperately tried to mitigate this by coating metal parts with mud or soot, but these temporary fixes wore off quickly with use. Even the brass cartridge cases ejected from the rifle could be a liability. Their bright flash as they spun through the air in the sunlight, acting as yet another signal to the ever-watchful enemy. The litany of inadequate equipment and tactical disadvantages created a foundation for psychological pressures that would have been unimaginable to the military planners who conceived of this specialized role. The intimate nature of sniper warfare, combined with the unique stresses of operating as an isolated hunter in a landscape defined by mass, impersonal slaughter, created mental burdens that distinguished these soldiers from their infantry counterparts in profound and often devastating ways. The simple act of killing through a telescopic sight transformed warfare from a chaotic exchange of fire into something that felt disturbingly close to individual murder. An infantry soldier participating in a trench assault rarely saw his victims clearly. He fired into a maelstrom of smoke and confusion, where enemy soldiers appeared as indistinct, fleeting shapes. The sniper, by contrast, studied his targets for hours through high-powered optics. He observed their facial expressions, their personal habits, and their individual mannerisms before deliberately pulling the trigger. This extended period of observation created a psychological intimacy with the enemy that proved deeply unsettling. Herbert McBride, a sniper serving with the 21st Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, described this phenomenon in his memoirs. Through his aldoscope, the German trenches, magnified 4 times, became a miniature theater where individual human dramas played out in meticulous detail. He would watch German soldiers for entire mornings, noting how they moved when they ate and how they interacted with their comrades. The enemy ceased to be a faceless monolith and became a collection of individuals. McBride recalled one German soldier in particular who followed a precise morning routine. Every day at exactly 7:30 a.m., this man would emerge to empty a latrine bucket, after which he would always pause to light a cigarette before returning to the safety of his dugout. The routine became so familiar that McBride found himself anticipating the man's appearance, studying his face and his weary movements with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. This was no longer an anonymous enemy, but a man with predictable human habits. This enforced intimacy created psychological conflicts that military training had never prepared a soldier to face. Snipers found themselves developing a peculiar and unsettling familiarity with their enemies, recognizing faces and predicting behaviors in a way that made the eventual act of killing feel deeply and uncomfortably personal. The German soldier with the morning routine was no longer just a target of opportunity. He was a specific human being, a known character in the sniper's isolated world. When McBride finally shot this man on a Tuesday morning in October of 1916, he reported feeling as though he had murdered someone he knew personally. He had never spoken a word to his victim, never met him outside the cold glass lens of his scope. Yet the connection forged through hours of silent observation made the act feel like a profound personal transgression. This was the unique and heavy burden of the Great War sniper. The prolonged periods of observation required for effective sniping created other psychological distortions. Staring for 12 to 16 hours a day through a scope, a sniper would enter an almost hypnotic state. The circular field of view became his entire world, a narrow tunnel of vision that isolated him from his immediate surroundings. He became disconnected from his own forces, while becoming ever more absorbed into the detailed lives playing out in the enemy trenches he watched so intently. German sniper accounts from the Somme offensive describe a similar psychological displacement. Marksmen reported that they began to feel more connected to the British soldiers they observed day after day than to their own comrades in the trenches behind them. The enemy positions, viewed through powerful Zeiss optics, became a familiar, intimate territory, while their own rear lines remained largely unknown. This created a profound sense of existing between two worlds, belonging fully to neither the enemy they studied nor the friendly forces they served. The immense responsibility of making life or death decisions based on fleeting observations through a scope created another layer of psychological pressure. The sniper had to determine in a split second whether a figure moving in the enemy trench was a legitimate military target, an officer, a machine gunner, or a non-combatant who should be spared, like a medic or a stretcher bearer. These decisions, made under extreme time pressure and often in poor visibility, carried a moral weight that haunted many marksmen long after the war had ended. However, all of these pressures paled in comparison to the unique psychological terror of the counter-sniper threat. While every soldier in the trenches faced the constant, impersonal danger of artillery, machine guns, and gas, the sniper confronted the additional knowledge that an enemy specialist was specifically hunting him as an individual. This was not the random chance of a stray bullet or shell. This was a personalized, methodical threat that bred a unique form of paranoia and hypervigilance that went far beyond normal combat stress. German counter-sniper doctrine, in particular, emphasized the systematic elimination of Allied marksmen through carefully planned stalking operations. These German specialists, often working in pairs, would spend days studying the British lines, identifying likely sniper locations, and planning elaborate ambushes. They were not simply reacting to shots fired. They were proactively hunting their counterparts. This methodical approach created a psychological atmosphere where every movement, every shot, and every moment of exposure felt like it could be your last. British snipers operating in the infamous Ypres salient reported a constant feeling of being watched, as though unseen eyes were studying their every move through a powerful telescopic sight. The knowledge that German forces kept meticulous logs of their activity added to this pressure. They knew that a successful shot fired on Monday would be recorded, its location triangulated, and by Tuesday, that very position would likely be the target of a carefully orchestrated response. The systematic nature of this threat meant a sniper could never feel safe, even in a position that had previously proven successful. This relentless cat-and-mouse game created psychological pressures that persisted even during quiet periods. Snipers became obsessed with analyzing every minute detail of their concealment. Was their camouflage adequate? Had their movement patterns been observed? Was an enemy sniper already sighted in on their position, simply waiting for them to make a fatal mistake? This constant state of hypervigilance was mentally and physically exhausting, degrading a marksman's effectiveness and making him more vulnerable to the very errors he feared. The profound isolation that characterized sniper operations compounded these psychological burdens. While an infantry soldier was part of a closely knit platoon that provided mutual support and camaraderie, the sniper typically worked alone or in a small two-man team, detached from the regular military structure. This meant that when the psychological pressures became overwhelming, the sniper lacked the immediate social support system that helped other soldiers cope with the horrors of combat. Regular infantry soldiers could share their experiences with comrades who faced the exact same dangers. The shared terror of a trench raid or an artillery barrage created powerful bonds of mutual understanding and support. The sniper, however, faced a set of challenges that his non-sniper comrades could not fully grasp. The psychological impact of long-range, intimate killing was an experience that most soldiers never had, creating an invisible wall between the marksman and the very men he fought alongside. This separation was compounded by the necessarily secretive nature of their operations. To maintain security, snipers frequently operated from concealed posts that were unknown even to friendly forces in the area. They moved through the lines like ghosts, often at night, using routes that were off-limits to regular infantry. The absolute need for operational security meant that snipers could not discuss their missions, their locations, or their targets with other soldiers, deepening their psychological isolation and cutting them off from the normal channels of communication and camaraderie. A distinct social stigma was also often attached to the sniper's role. Many common soldiers viewed snipers with a mixture of awe and suspicion, seeing them as cold-blooded killers who engaged in a form of warfare that seemed to violate the unwritten, if naive, codes of honorable combat. The personal, calculated, and deliberate way in which a sniper selected and dispatched his target created an impression that these soldiers were fundamentally different from the regular infantryman who was seen as fighting a more conventional, less personal war. This perception, while largely inaccurate given the extreme dangers snipers faced, sometimes bred resentment. The fact that snipers typically operated from hidden positions, away from the daily grind and shared misery of the front-line trench, could create a sense among other soldiers that they were avoiding their fair share of the risk. An infantryman, standing in knee-deep water under constant shell fire, might look upon the lone sniper as someone who had found an escape from the worst horrors of the line, not understanding the unique and terrifying pressures of the marksman's lonely war. The specialized equipment and training snipers received could create further barriers. The expensive telescopic sights, the additional instruction in marksmanship and fieldcraft, and the occasional access to better quality ammunition set them apart. While these advantages were essential for their role, They could foster a perception that snipers were a privileged elite. Regular soldiers, struggling with worn-out rifles and minimal training, sometimes viewed the specialists in their midst with a degree of jealousy and mistrust. The official duties of the sniper added another heavy psychological burden. Military doctrine emphasized the importance of targeting high-value individuals. Enemy officers, specialists, and other key personnel whose elimination would cause the maximum disruption to the enemy's operations. This meant that snipers were specifically tasked with a form of targeted assassination, deliberately seeking out individuals whose deaths would cripple the enemy's command and control. The killing of an enemy officer carried a psychological weight that was significantly different from the killing of an enlisted man. Officers were typically identifiable, often displaying acts of courage and leadership that were visible even from a distance. To study such a man for hours, to observe his character, and then to deliberately kill him felt less like a legitimate act of war and more like a political assassination, creating moral conflicts that affected many marksmen for the rest of their lives. The targeting of specialists created similar psychological pressures. Snipers were tasked with hunting and eliminating their opposite numbers, as well as machine gun crews, artillery observers, and communications personnel. These were the men whose specialized skills made them particularly valuable to the enemy and particularly dangerous. This created a grim, professional form of warfare where experts hunted their counterparts across the desolate landscape, each fully aware that they were, in turn, being hunted with the same methodical precision. This knowledge had a profound effect on a sniper's mindset. He understood that his specialized role and unique equipment made him a high-priority target for enemy elimination. This created a constant, underlying awareness that he was being sought by skilled adversaries equipped with precision weapons. Every tactical decision had to be weighed against this heightened personal risk, balancing the need to engage a target with the ever-present danger of exposing his position to an enemy who was looking for him specifically. The retaliation that often followed a successful sniper operation created a psychological pressure that extended beyond the immediate danger to the marksman himself. Enemy forces would frequently respond to effective sniper fire with a disproportionate and indiscriminate show of force. A single, well-aimed shot could trigger a concentrated artillery bombardment, a trench mortar barrage, or a violent night raid, endangering not only the sniper, but also all the friendly infantry in the surrounding sector. This reality created a terrible moral conflict for many marksmen. They knew that their success might bring death and destruction down upon their own comrades. British snipers, operating on the Somme front, reported that a successful engagement against a German target would often result in an immediate and furious artillery response on the nearby infantry positions. The knowledge that their actions might get their fellow soldiers killed or wounded created a heavy burden, forcing them to weigh the value of their shot against the potential cost to others. Some snipers began to question whether their individual kills could possibly justify the risk of triggering a bombardment that might kill dozens of their comrades. This moral calculus could lead to a paralyzing hesitation, reducing a sniper's effectiveness and adding another layer to his already immense psychological load. The decision to pull the trigger was no longer just a tactical one. It was a moral one, with the lives of the men in the trenches around him hanging in the balance. The cumulative effect of these relentless psychological pressures, the intimate killing, the constant fear of being hunted, the social isolation, and the moral burden of retaliation inevitably led to severe mental health problems. Yet, the military medicine of the era was utterly ill-equipped to address them. The concept of combat stress reaction, what we would later come to understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, was in its infancy and poorly understood. The unique psychological challenges faced by snipers were not recognized as a legitimate medical concern at all. As a result, snipers who buckled under the unbearable strain were often met not with compassion or treatment, but with scorn and punishment. They were frequently dismissed as cowards, shirkers, or malingerers. Their invisible wounds went unseen and unacknowledged by a military system that had no framework for understanding the profound psychological trauma inflicted by this unique and brutal form of warfare. They were left to suffer in silence, their silent screams unheard. The psychological warfare that defined the individual sniper's experience soon transformed into something far more systematic and deadly. As military commanders on both sides began to recognize the profound tactical impact of precision marksmen, the isolated duels between lone snipers evolved into coordinated campaigns, specialized teams, advanced equipment, and institutionalized knowledge turned countersniping into a methodical military science. The hunter became the hunted in a way that fundamentally altered the nature of warfare on the Western Front, creating new and terrifying categories of battlefield risk. German forces, in particular, pioneered this systematic approach to counter-sniper operations. They established dedicated teams, known as Scharfschützentrupps, whose sole mission was the identification and elimination of Allied marksmen. These units operated with a level of organization and technical sophistication that caught the British and French forces completely by surprise. This was not the reactive harassment fire of an individual soldier. This was a proactive, institutionalized campaign of targeted assassination, and the German teams were its masters. A typical German counter-sniper team consisted of 3 or 4 specialists, each with a clearly defined role designed to maximize their collective effectiveness. A primary observer, equipped with the finest high-magnification Zeiss telescopes and carefully calibrated range-finding equipment, would spend his entire day studying the Allied lines for the slightest sign of sniper activity. His job was not to shoot, but to see, and to record everything he saw with meticulous, scientific precision. These observers maintained extraordinarily detailed logs, noting the precise time, location, and circumstances of every single shot fired from the enemy sector. Over weeks and months, these logs created a comprehensive database of information, revealing patterns in Allied sniper deployments, favored times of activity, and preferred types of positions. This data-driven approach allowed German teams to move beyond simple reaction and begin predicting where and when their targets would appear. This systematic observation was translated onto detailed tactical maps. These were not the standard-issue maps of the trenches. They were living documents, updated daily with new intelligence that marked every potential Allied firing position. A shell crater used by a British sniper on Tuesday would be marked on German maps by Tuesday evening. A loophole in a ruined wall would be noted and indexed. The entire battlefield was rendered into a grid of known threats, allowing German teams to plan their elimination strategies with the cold calculation of a chess master. The marksmen in these German teams received specialized training that emphasized patience, precision, and, most importantly, coordinated teamwork. They learned to operate in pairs, with one sniper acting as the shooter, while his partner served as a spotter. observing the target and the fall of the shot. This coordinated approach allowed them to engage targets with greater accuracy and provide immediate follow-up shots if the first one missed, a luxury the solo Allied sniper rarely had. The psychological impact of facing these organized, methodical teams was devastating for Allied marksmen who had largely been trained to operate as individuals. The chilling realization that you were not simply engaged in a duel with another lone shooter, but were instead the designated target of an entire, dedicated elimination squad, introduced a new and deeply personal level of fear into the sniper's already terrifying existence. The equipment issued to these elite German counter-sniper teams reflected the systematic seriousness of their mission. They received the finest optical instruments available, including Zeiss telescopes with magnifications of up to 12 power, far exceeding the typical 3 or 4 power scopes used by their Allied counterparts. These optics featured advanced reticle systems that allowed for precise range estimation and windage correction, giving German marksmen a significant technical advantage in the complex ballistic calculations of long-range warfare. Their rifles represented the pinnacle of First World War precision weapon development. They were not standard, off-the-line infantry weapons. Instead, armorers hand-selected the most accurate Mauser 1898 rifles, which then underwent extensive modification. Barrels were chosen for their exceptional consistency. Actions were carefully tuned and smoothed for a precise trigger pull, and the completed weapons were mated to robust mounting systems designed to hold their zero under the harshest field conditions. The ammunition these teams used was another critical component of their superiority. Special loading facilities produced cartridges specifically for sniper use, manufactured to far tighter tolerances than standard infantry rounds. Powder charges were measured to the individual grain, and bullets were individually inspected and sorted by weight. This fanatical attention to ammunition quality gave German marksmen the shot-to-shot consistency necessary for engaging targets at ranges that would have been a matter of pure luck for Allied snipers using mass-produced, inconsistent cartridges. Faced with this systematic threat, British forces initially struggled to develop an effective response. They lacked both the institutional knowledge and the specialized equipment necessary to compete. Early British counter-sniper efforts consisted mostly of individual marksmen attempting to hunt German snipers using traditional stalking techniques. These methods, developed for hunting game, proved tragically inadequate against a highly organized and technologically superior military opposition. The core of the British problem was a lack of coordinated doctrine. Their snipers, though often brave and skilled individuals, largely operated in isolation. They were lone wolves sent out to face organized packs. This made them incredibly vulnerable to the methodical elimination campaigns conducted by the German teams, who could focus their combined efforts on one Allied sniper after another, systematically clearing them from a sector. The development of a true British counter-sniper capability required fundamental changes in training, equipment, and tactical thinking that took many months to implement. Specialized schools were eventually established to teach advanced observation techniques, ballistics, and coordinated teamwork. However, these facilities could not produce qualified specialists quickly enough to replace the heavy losses on the front. Furthermore, there was a desperate shortage of qualified instructors. The most experienced snipers were often the first to fall victim to their German counterparts. The French experience followed a similar, painful pattern of initial inadequacy, followed by a slow, gradual improvement. French forces suffered particularly heavy casualties from snipers throughout 1915 and early 1916, as their marksmen lacked the training and equipment to survive against the organized German threat. The French response, like the British, involved the belated establishment of specialized counter-sniper schools and a desperate effort to develop and manufacture indigenous optical equipment that could begin to compete with the superb German Zeiss products. Artillery observers represented another critical category of specialist who played a decisive role in the escalating science of counter-sniper warfare. They provided the overwhelming firepower necessary to eliminate enemy marksmen who were too well concealed or too well protected to be engaged effectively with small arms. The systematic integration of artillery transformed the battlefield, elevating the counter-sniper fight from an individual duel into a coordinated combined arms campaign that could bring death from miles away. German artillery observers, much like their infantry counterparts in the sniper teams, maintained meticulous records of Allied activity. From their own hidden observation posts, equipped with powerful telescopes and detailed maps, they could call down concentrated bombardments on any suspected sniper location with devastating accuracy. They worked in close cooperation with the counter-sniper teams, sharing intelligence and coordinating attacks that could neutralize an Allied marksman through a precisely timed shell burst. This seamless integration of artillery support with infantry counter-sniper operations created a level of tactical sophistication that Allied forces struggled to match for much of the war. A German sniper team might locate and pin down an Allied sniper with harassing fire, while an artillery observer miles away directed a battery of guns to obliterate the position entirely. The Allied sniper was thus caught in a deadly, multi-layered trap hunted by both rifle and cannon. A key element of this system was the pre-registration of artillery fire on suspected sniper positions. German artillery units maintained detailed firing data for hundreds of potential enemy hides, loopholes, and observation posts within a given sector. This meant the complex calculations for range, elevation, and windage were already complete. When a forward observer called for fire on one of these pre-registered targets, a battery could deliver an accurate shell within minutes, sometimes seconds. The psychological impact of this capability was immense. A British sniper who betrayed his position, perhaps through the smoke from his rifle or a glint from his scope, might find himself bracketed by accurate artillery fire before he even had a chance to relocate. This knowledge that a single mistake could result in near instantaneous obliteration created an almost unbearable level of stress, affecting a marksman's confidence and his ability to make calm, tactical decisions under fire. The nature of the artillery fire itself was specialized for the task. German batteries developed specific techniques for engaging point targets, like sniper positions. They might use high-explosive shells with delayed fuses designed to penetrate a layer of earth or a brick wall before exploding, killing the occupant inside. Alternatively, they could use air-bursting shrapnel shells timed to explode above a position, raining down a deadly cone of metal fragments over a wide area to maximize the chances of hitting a single, concealed individual. British artillery observers gradually developed similar capabilities, but their learning curve was steep and paid for with the lives of their snipers. Early British counter-battery efforts often lacked the systematic, proactive approach of the Germans, relying on reactive fire missions called in after a sniper was already under attack. For much of the war, Allied marksmen operated without the kind of integrated and immediate fire support that their German counterparts could rely on, leaving them dangerously exposed in their lonely forward posts. The maps maintained by the specialized counter-sniper teams were far more than simple navigational aids. They were sophisticated intelligence documents that recorded every aspect of the enemy's operations in minute detail. German teams created elaborate sketches of the Allied trench systems, marking not just known sniper hides, but also potential firing positions, likely nighttime approach routes, and patches of dead ground that might offer concealment. These maps were living documents, constantly revised with every new piece of intelligence, providing German snipers with a comprehensive and evolving understanding of their opponent's territory. The intelligence gathering process that supported these operations was multifaceted, drawing information from numerous sources to create a complete picture of enemy activity. Aerial reconnaissance, a burgeoning field of military science, provided overhead photographs of Allied positions. These images could reveal sniper hides, communication trenches, and supply routes that were perfectly concealed from ground-level observation. A position that seemed invisible from the front could appear as a stark, obvious anomaly from 1,000 feet in the air, its telltale tracks and spoil heap giving it away. Information was also systematically extracted from prisoners of war. Interrogations of captured Allied soldiers could yield a treasure trove of intelligence regarding sniper training methods, equipment capabilities, and standard tactical procedures. This information helped counter-sniper teams to build a behavioral profile of their opponents, allowing them to better anticipate their actions and exploit their doctrinal weaknesses. Sometimes, a prisoner might even reveal the location or identity of a particularly effective sniper, placing a direct target on that individual's back. More technical methods of detection were also employed. Sound ranging, originally developed to locate enemy artillery, was adapted to pinpoint sniper positions. Networks of listening posts, equipped with sensitive microphones, could detect the acoustic signature of a rifle's muzzle blast. By measuring the tiny differences in the time the sound arrived at each post, technicians could triangulate the shot's point of origin with surprising accuracy, allowing for retaliatory fire even when the sniper himself had never been seen. Crucially, German forces developed highly efficient systems for sharing this counter-sniper intelligence between units. It was not enough to simply collect the data. It had to be disseminated to ensure it reached all relevant personnel quickly and accurately. Daily intelligence summaries, distributed down to the company level, included detailed reports on enemy sniper activity. This meant a sniper team rotating into a new sector would arrive with a full briefing on known enemy positions, tactics, and recent activity. This systematic approach to intelligence gathering and sharing created a powerful institutional knowledge base. It ensured that hard-won lessons were not lost when a team was transferred or suffered casualties. German counter-sniper operations became increasingly effective as the war progressed because they were constantly building upon a growing shared library of information about their adversaries. The Allied sniper was not just fighting against the man he could see. He was fighting against an entire, invisible system of observation and analysis that knew his habits, his equipment, and his likely locations. The elimination campaigns conducted by these German counter-sniper teams followed a set of systematic procedures designed to maximize their effectiveness while minimizing their own casualties. An operation would typically begin not with a gunshot, but with an extended period of quiet observation. For days, the German team would study the Allied sector, confirming the locations of active snipers identified through intelligence, analyzing their routines, and planning a coordinated attack that might eliminate multiple targets in a single, swift action. The methodical nature of these operations meant that Allied snipers were not facing individual hunters, but rather organized military units executing a precise mission. When the moment came to strike, the German teams would often act in concert, with multiple shooters engaging different targets simultaneously. This coordination was crucial. It prevented one Allied sniper from being alerted by the sound of a shot fired at his comrade down the line, ensuring the highest possible chance of success against all designated targets. The coordination required for these campaigns involved multiple levels of command and control. Reflecting the systematic approach German forces brought to this specialized form of warfare, the counter-sniper teams often reported directly to regimental headquarters, which would, in turn, coordinate their operations with artillery units, aerial reconnaissance assets, and intelligence personnel. This high-level integration ensured that the counter-sniper mission received the support and resources necessary for success, weaving it into the broader tactical fabric of the front. German counter-sniper doctrine emphasized the importance of eliminating Allied marksmen quickly and decisively. The goal was to prevent them from having any chance to adapt to German tactics or relocate to new, unknown positions. This emphasis on rapid annihilation created tactical procedures that prioritized speed and overwhelming force over the slow, patient stalk of a single marksman. The teams were trained to strike with lethal efficiency, bringing the full weight of their coordinated system to bear on their targets. The psychological impact of facing these systematic elimination campaigns was profoundly demoralizing for Allied snipers. They had been trained for a war of individuals, a contest of skill and fieldcraft against a single opponent. Instead, they found themselves hunted by an impersonal, highly organized military machine. The terror was not just of being killed, but of being targeted, catalogued, and systematically dismantled by an enemy who seemed to know their every move. Amidst this brutal reality, a question often arises about the fate of snipers who were captured. Officially, their treatment was supposed to follow the same protocols established for any other prisoner of war. Despite the personal animosity that often developed between opposing marksmen, military law and international conventions like the Hague and Geneva Conventions provided clear guidelines. A sniper, regardless of his deadly role, was a uniformed combatant entitled to the protections afforded to all prisoners. However, the grim tactical reality often made these legal protections moot. The very nature of sniper operations, isolated, far forward, with limited escape routes, meant the opportunity for capture rarely presented itself. When a sniper's position was overrun, he was far more likely to be killed in the chaos of the assault than to be taken prisoner. The systematic nature of counter-sniper warfare was focused on elimination, not capture, making surrender a highly perilous and often unavailable option. The systematic elimination campaigns that defined counter-sniper warfare created tactical pressures that were almost insurmountable. Yet these paled in comparison to the environmental challenges that confronted every marksman on the Western Front, while German teams methodically hunted their Allied counterparts, and artillery observers called down precise bombardments. The weather, the terrain, and the sheer filth of trench warfare created a different, more universal category of suffering. This was a war not just against a human enemy, but against the very world itself. The environmental conditions of the Western Front transformed the delicate art of precision, shooting from a technical challenge into a brutal test of physical endurance that pushed human capabilities to their absolute limits. The persistent, miserable rain that defined the climate of regions like Flanders created shooting conditions that would be considered utterly impossible in any peacetime training scenario. The water turned the very ground the sniper relied upon for cover and stability into a relentless enemy. During the autumn of 1916, for example, rainfall continued almost without interruption from September through December, turning the battlefield of the Somme into a vast, liquid quagmire. The carefully prepared firing positions that snipers had dug during the drier summer months dissolved into waterlogged holes that offered neither comfort nor stable footing. The water would seep in relentlessly, filling every depression and turning the sniper's hide into a freezing, muddy bath. British sniper Harold Furness, operating with the 1st Battalion of the Leicestershire Regiment, described lying in a shell crater that he had converted into a hide, watching as filthy rainwater slowly rose around his body. He lay for hours as the water crept up to his chest, forcing him into a grim choice: either abandon his tactically vital position or remain and accept the inevitable onset of life-threatening hypothermia. This was a battle that no amount of marksmanship training could prepare a soldier for. The water that accumulated in these improvised positions was far from clean. It was a putrid soup, thick with mud and the decomposing organic matter that littered the landscape. This contaminated liquid soaked through clothing and equipment within hours. The leather slings and scope covers on rifles would absorb it and begin to rot. Wooden rifle stocks would swell and warp, completely changing the weapon's point of impact and destroying its carefully established zero. Metal components, despite their protective coatings, would begin to rust and corrode. This constant moisture actively worked against the sniper's attempts at concealment. The natural materials, like grass and leaves, that marksmen used to break up their outlines, would begin to decompose within hours in the damp conditions. This rotting vegetation gave off a distinct, sour odor that experienced enemy observers were trained to detect. The very camouflage that was supposed to save a sniper's life could become a liability, its smell betraying his hidden position to the enemy. The clothing issued to soldiers was completely inadequate for this environment. The standard issue wool uniform, while reasonably warm when dry, lost almost all of its insulating properties once saturated. It would absorb several pounds of water, becoming incredibly heavy, restricting movement, and actively leaching heat from the sniper's body. For a marksman forced to remain motionless for hours in a water-filled hole, this was a direct path to exposure and a slow, miserable death from the cold. German snipers faced similar difficulties with their standard issue equipment. Their field gray wool uniforms also became heavy and restrictive when soaked with rainwater. The synthetic dyes used in German military clothing as the war progressed would often run when exposed to persistent moisture, creating unnatural staining patterns that could compromise a carefully prepared camouflage position. Their leather equipment, from ammunition pouches to scope cases, would swell and distort when wet, making it a struggle to access vital gear in a critical moment. When the rains of autumn gave way to the freezing temperatures of winter, a host of new and even more insidious environmental challenges emerged. The bitter cold attacked every aspect of a sniper's operation, from the mechanical function of his weapon to the biological function of his own body. In the frozen landscape of a winter front, the already difficult task of precision marksmanship became a desperate struggle against the simple, brutal laws of physics and physiology. The extreme cold had a direct and measurable effect on the rifle itself. As the temperature dropped, the metal components of the weapon would contract. This thermal contraction, however slight, was enough to alter the rifle's point of impact, affecting accuracy by several inches at extended ranges. British snipers operating during the brutal winter of 1916-1917 reported that their Lee-Enfield rifles would shoot consistently and predictably low as soon as the temperature fell below freezing, requiring them to constantly recalculate their aim to compensate. The delicate optical equipment that snipers relied upon became nearly useless in the depths of winter. The lenses of their telescopic sights would fog over instantly when exposed to the temperature differential between the outside air and the sniper's body heat. Worse, any moisture that had found its way inside the scope body, a near certainty in the damp trenches, would freeze solid, encasing the delicate internal adjustment mechanisms in ice and rendering them immovable and useless. Even the superior German Zeisscopes were particularly vulnerable due to their complex internal engineering. Snipers learned to keep their precious scopes tucked inside their greatcoats, close to their bodies, to protect them from the cold. But this was a temporary solution that created its own problems. The moment the warm scope was brought out into the freezing air to take a shot, its lenses would be immediately blinded by a thick layer of condensation, forcing the sniper to wait precious minutes for it to clear, minutes he rarely had. Ammunition, too, was profoundly affected by the cold. The cordite propellant in British cartridges burned erratically and inconsistently at freezing temperatures, again creating unpredictable variations in muzzle velocity. A cartridge that had been exposed to the winter air might produce a velocity 150 feet per second, slower than one kept warm in a pocket. At several hundred yards, this difference was enough to cause a complete miss, turning a carefully aimed shot into a futile gesture. To combat this, snipers would keep a small number of ready rounds inside their clothing, nestled in a pocket to keep them at a consistent temperature. However, this practice severely limited the number of reliable shots they could fire. Once those few warm rounds were expended, they were forced to rely on frozen, unpredictable ammunition, turning every subsequent shot into a gamble against the elements. The human body itself began to break down under these conditions. Hypothermia was a constant threat, setting in after hours of motionless waiting, the uncontrollable shivering that marks the early stages of exposure would violently shake the sniper's entire body, making it physically impossible to maintain a steady sight picture. This created a cruel irony. The very patience required to be a successful sniper was the exact behavior that made him most vulnerable to the cold that would render his skills useless. Trench foot was another debilitating condition that relentlessly attacked snipers in their static, waterlogged hides. The constant exposure to cold and wet would cause the skin on the feet and lower legs to break down, leading to painful sores, fungal infections, and, in severe cases, gangrene. British medical records from the Somme offensive indicate that trench foot affected nearly 20% of marksmen operating in forward positions during the autumn of 1916. with many cases being so severe that they required evacuation from the front line entirely. The painful swelling made it agonizing to move between positions and impossible to maintain the steady, precise body posture required for accurate shooting. Frostbite presented an even more acute danger during the depths of winter. The body parts most vulnerable were the extremities that were often exposed during operations: the fingers, toes, nose, and ears. For a sniper, his hands were his most critical and most vulnerable asset. He required bare finger contact with the cold metal of his rifle's trigger and the delicate adjustment knobs of his scope, making his hands exceptionally susceptible to cold injury. This direct exposure could lead to permanent nerve damage and loss of dexterity, a career-ending injury for a precision marksman. German sniper accounts from the winter of 1917-1918 describe men who suffered such severe frostbite to their trigger fingers that they could no longer operate their rifles effectively. The damage was permanent, robbing them of the fine motor control essential for their craft. Even after the immediate injury had healed, the lingering numbness and stiffness made the delicate art of a perfect trigger squeeze an impossibility. The cold had, in effect, surgically removed their ability to perform their duty. Beyond the weather, the very terrain of the Western Front created its own set of distinct environmental challenges, which varied significantly by geographic sector. The clay soil that predominated in the Somme region would, with the addition of rain, transform into a thick, clinging, glutinous mud. This mud made any movement physically exhausting, while also creating obvious tracks and disturbances that could be easily spotted by enemy observers. A sniper attempting to crawl to a new position would accumulate a thick, heavy shell of mud on his uniform and equipment, creating a dark, obvious silhouette against the landscape. In stark contrast, the chalk downs that characterized parts of the front near Arras created a different but equally lethal problem. When the white chalk was struck by a bullet or shell fragment, it would erupt in a distinctive puff of bright white dust. This dust cloud would linger in the air for several minutes, providing an immediate and unmistakable visual signature of the sniper's location. A single shot, perfectly aimed, would be betrayed by a plume of white dust that could be seen by German observers from over half a mile away, making it impossible to remain concealed after an engagement. The sandy soil found in sectors of the Belgian front near the coast presented yet another set of challenges. This loose, granular earth was incredibly unstable. The constant impact of artillery bombardments would cause the ground to shift and settle continuously. This meant it was impossible to construct a stable firing position that would maintain its zero over time. A sniper could spend hours carefully preparing a concealed hide, only to find that an overnight shelling had completely altered the terrain, rendering all his carefully prepared range cards and reference points utterly useless by morning. The broad, seasonal changes that swept across the Western Front created additional layers of complexity, forcing snipers to constantly adapt their tactics, equipment, and mindset. Spring brought a surge of new vegetation. While this fresh green growth could offer improved concealment, it also obscured the familiar terrain features that marksmen used for range estimation. The entire landscape changed its character in a matter of weeks, requiring constant reconnaissance and adjustment of camouflage techniques to match the evolving natural background. Summer brought oppressive heat, which created a unique visibility problem that plagued long-range shooting. heat mirage. The intense thermal currents rising from the sun-baked earth would distort the air, causing images viewed through a telescopic sight to shimmer, waver, and dance. German snipers reported that during the hottest parts of a summer afternoon, targets would appear to float and bend, making a precise shot a complete impossibility. This optical distortion often forced snipers to restrict their activities to the cooler hours of the early morning and late evening. The autumn months were defined by fog. A thick, heavy fog could descend upon the front and persist for days at a time, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards and rendering the sniper completely blind to his long-range targets. This often eliminated the crucial dawn and dusk periods, when enemy activity was typically at its highest. While the fog could provide cover for movement, it robbed the sniper of his primary function, leaving him isolated and useless in his hide. Winter introduced the stark challenge of snow. A blanket of fresh snow dramatically altered the appearance of the landscape. But its greatest danger was the way it recorded movement. It became impossible for a sniper to approach or leave a forward position without leaving a perfect trail of footprints leading directly to his hide. Furthermore, the white background made standard khaki or field gray uniforms stand out with lethal clarity, forcing marksmen to desperately improvise white camouflage from any material they could find, such as bedsheets or sacks, which were rarely available in forward positions. On top of these immense environmental struggles, the general sanitary conditions of the front lines created a host of health hazards that affected a sniper's ability to function. The trenches were infested with vermin, and for the isolated sniper, these pests posed a particular threat. The rat population of the Western Front was legendary, swollen to enormous sizes by feasting on the abundant corpses. These rodents would chew through a sniper's webbing, his ammunition pouches, and his precious food rations, destroying essential supplies. The constant noise and movement of rats in a supposedly silent, concealed position could also betray a sniper's location to an enemy patrol with keen ears. British accounts are filled with descriptions of rats the size of small cats, grown bold and aggressive. They would swarm over sleeping soldiers, and their bites would frequently become infected in the unsanitary conditions, leading to serious illness. For a sniper trying to get a few hours of precious rest during daylight, the constant threat of these creatures was another exhausting source of stress and fatigue. Lice were another persistent misery. Body lice infested the seams of military clothing and multiplied rapidly, creating an intense, maddening itch that made it nearly impossible for a soldier to remain still. For a sniper, whose job demanded absolute motionlessness for hours on end, this was a unique form of torture. The constant need to scratch and shift to relieve the itching could create just enough movement to be detected by an enemy observer, forcing a sniper to choose between enduring the torment and compromising his position. The delousing procedures available during the First World War were crude and largely ineffective, especially for men operating in isolated forward positions. A sniper might go for weeks without the opportunity to properly wash himself or his clothing, allowing lice populations to reach epidemic levels. The secondary infections that resulted from constantly scratching at the bites would create open sores that, in the filth of the trenches, almost inevitably became infected, leading to debilitating skin diseases and fever. Disease transmission was a constant and deadly threat. The stagnant, contaminated water that collected in shell holes was a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites that caused dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. A sniper, isolated for days and running low on his water supply, might be forced to drink from these sources out of sheer desperation. The resulting severe gastrointestinal illnesses would incapacitate him for weeks, rendering him utterly incapable of maintaining the steady posture and intense focus required for his duties. The very observation posts that snipers chose for their tactical advantages were often located in the most contaminated areas of the front. These positions, selected for their fields of fire and concealment, frequently occupied the lowest available ground, where human waste, decomposing matter, and stagnant, polluted water would naturally collect. This grim intersection of tactical necessity and environmental contamination created a perfect storm of health hazards that attacked every aspect of a sniper's life and effectiveness. These environmental challenges, which transformed every sniper's hide into a trial of physical endurance, created the foundation for an even more fundamental set of problems that struck at the very heart of precision marksmanship itself. While snipers battled hypothermia and disease, the basic physics of long-range shooting presented mathematical challenges that were nearly impossible to solve with the technology of the day. The ballistic limitations of their ammunition, combined with primitive range-finding equipment, created a deadly equation where skill was often overruled by simple, unpredictable chance. The cordite-propelled ammunition that was the standard for British forces suffered from such wild inconsistencies that precise ballistic calculation was a fantasy. As mentioned, powder charges in .303 cartridges could vary enough to alter muzzle velocity by up to 200 feet per second from one round to the next, at a range of 500 yards. This velocity variation alone meant that one bullet might strike 18 inches high, while the next, fired from the same rifle with an identical aim point, could impact 2 feet low. The mathematical complexity of trying to compensate for these variables was staggering. To accurately calculate a bullet's drop over distance, a sniper needed to know its precise muzzle velocity. But this figure changed constantly, varying not only with each inconsistent cartridge, but also with the ambient temperature, humidity, and even the age of the ammunition. A sniper engaging a target at 600 yards needed to account for roughly 5 feet of bullet drop, but the actual drop could vary by 20 inches or more, turning a theoretically precise shot into a hopeful guess. German 7.92 mm Mauser ammunition, while generally better made in the early years, also suffered as the war dragged on, as Germany's industrial capacity was strained to the breaking point by the Allied blockade and the demands of total war. Ammunition quality declined significantly. By 1917, German snipers were reporting that their carefully calculated firing solutions had become unreliable due to increasing variations in powder charges and bullets made from inferior substitute metals, which exhibited erratic and unpredictable performance. The very design of the bullets used in military ammunition created further ballistic complications. The full metal jacket, round-nosed projectiles required by international law were aerodynamically inefficient. Unlike the sleek, pointed boat-tail bullets used in modern precision shooting, which are designed to slip through the air with minimal resistance, these older projectiles created significant turbulence as they flew. This instability affected their flight path and made them far less accurate at extended ranges. A direct consequence of this inefficient design was a rapid loss of velocity. The heavy, blunt-nosed bullets shed their energy quickly, becoming increasingly unstable and susceptible to external forces, like wind, as they traveled downrange. A typical military bullet of the era would lose approximately 40% of its muzzle velocity by the time it reached a 600-yard target. This rapid deceleration created a steep, rainbow-like trajectory that was highly unforgiving of even the smallest error in range estimation. This steep trajectory curve made accurate range finding absolutely critical. If a sniper misjudged the distance to his target by a mere 50 yards, his bullet would pass 2 feet or more above or below his point of aim. This tiny margin of error, on a battlefield where every feature was constantly being altered by shellfire, meant that the chances of a first-round hit on a distant target were mathematically slim, even under perfect weather conditions. Of all the variables in the ballistic equation, however, wind was the most chaotic and unpredictable. The flat, open, shell-torn terrain of no man's land offered no natural windbreaks, allowing air currents to swirl and eddy in maddeningly inconsistent patterns. The constant artillery bombardments added to this chaos, generating their own thermal updrafts and pressure waves that could alter wind speed and direction from one second to the next. British sniper William Crum, operating near Messines Ridge, described the frustrating impossibility of reading the wind. He recalled watching blades of grass and loose debris swirl in different directions simultaneously across his field of fire. The wind that was pushing a bullet to the left at his firing position might be pushing it back to the right a few hundred yards downrange, making any attempt at compensation a complete shot in the dark. A bullet fired at a target 800 yards away would spend over a second in flight, a second during which it was at the complete mercy of these unseen forces. A moderate crosswind, encountered for even a fraction of that flight time, could deflect the bullet by several feet from its intended path. Calculating this drift with any accuracy was a nearly impossible task, turning long-range shooting into a constant battle against the atmosphere itself. The mathematical formulas required to accurately calculate wind deflection were far beyond the educational background of the average soldier. These complex calculations required knowledge of the bullet's time of flight, its ballistic coefficient, and the average wind velocity across the entire flight path. Snipers were forced to fall back on crude estimation techniques, like observing the movement of grass or the drift of smoke, methods that gave only a rough indication of the wind at their location and told them nothing about the conditions farther downrange. To make matters even worse, the constant artillery fire introduced another invisible atmospheric disturbance. The intense heat from exploding shells created rising columns of superheated air that would linger for several minutes. These thermal columns, while invisible to the naked eye, were dense enough to deflect a bullet's trajectory in unpredictable ways. A sniper had to learn to avoid shooting through areas that had been recently shelled. But on the active fronts of the Great War, finding a clear lane of fire was a rare luxury. Ground-level heat effects created similar mirage conditions that not only distorted the target's image, but also created real-world variations in air density that could cause a bullet to follow a curved or unpredictable flight path. During the summer months, the stark temperature difference between the sun-scorched earth and the cooler air above it created visible heat waves. These were the same thermal gradients that created visual distortion, but they also represented physical changes in the medium through which the bullet had to travel, adding yet another layer of invisible chaos to the ballistic equation. German sniper accounts from the summer of 1917 vividly describe how targets seen through high-powered scopes would appear to float and waver, their images displaced several inches above their actual positions by the intense mirage. This would lead to systematic aiming errors, with snipers consistently shooting high over their targets until the atmospheric conditions stabilized in the cooler evening hours. The very air had become an optical illusion, a treacherous and unreliable guide for a precision shot. Range estimation, however, was perhaps the single most critical skill required for a successful long-range shot, and it was here that the technological failings were most profound. The techniques and equipment available to the World War I sniper provided only crude approximations of the actual distance to a target. Most marksmen had to rely on the graduated reticles inside their telescopic sights, but these systems required the sniper to know the precise dimensions of his target, information that was rarely available on a chaotic battlefield. The sophisticated mil-dot reticles that are standard today, which allow for rapid and precise range calculation, had not yet been developed. Snipers were forced to work with much cruder measurement systems. Many British scopes featured simple crosshairs with no built-in range-finding aids at all, forcing the marksman to rely entirely on visual estimation, a method that became wildly inaccurate beyond 300 yards. A man-sized target at 500 yards looks remarkably similar to one at 600 yards, but the difference in bullet drop is measured in feet. While German forces possessed superior optical equipment, including some scopes with graduated reticles, these systems were often complex and difficult to use effectively under combat stress. The sophisticated markings on a Zeiss reticle required the operator to perform mathematical calculations to convert the visual measurement into a usable range. The theoretical advantages of these advanced systems often went unrealized in the field, where a sniper had only seconds to make his calculation before his target disappeared. This lack of reliable equipment forced snipers to develop improvised techniques. The most common was to judge the range based on the apparent size of an enemy soldier, assuming the target was approximately 6 feet tall. This method was fraught with error. It was useless if the target was partially concealed, stooping, or wearing bulky equipment that obscured his true dimensions. Using surrounding terrain features as reference points was equally unreliable on a landscape that was being constantly resculpted by artillery fire. Atmospheric conditions could play tricks on the human eye, further complicating visual range estimation. Haze, smoke, and fog would often make distant targets appear even farther away than they actually were, while the crisp, clear air after a rainstorm could make them seem deceptively close. These optical illusions could lead to range estimation errors of 25% or more, resulting in a clean miss, even if every other ballistic factor had been perfectly calculated. The final crushing element was time. Targets did not stand still. An enemy officer might appear for only a few seconds, forcing the sniper to make an instant judgment. In this high-pressure environment, the cumulative effect of all these variables made consistent long-range marksmanship a mathematical impossibility, reducing even the most skilled shooter to a state of desperate, educated guesswork. The mathematical impossibilities that plagued a sniper's every shot represented only the technical dimension of a far more systemic problem. While marksmen on the front line struggled with inconsistent ammunition and the unpredictable laws of physics, the military hierarchies that deployed them demonstrated a fundamental and often fatal misunderstanding of how these specialists should be employed. The organizational failures that characterized sniper operations transformed what should have been precision military assets into misused infantrymen, their unique skills squandered through ignorance and a tactical doctrine that had failed to evolve. At the heart of the problem was the tendency for commanders at the regimental and brigade levels to treat snipers not as unique specialists, but simply as infantry soldiers with better than average aim. Many officers, particularly in the British Army, had received their commissions through traditional military academies, where tactical knowledge was rooted in 19th century concepts of mass formations and direct assaults. They understood how to deploy a rifle company or a machine gun section, but they lacked the conceptual framework to employ individual marksmen to their best effect. The most common and wasteful misuse of snipers was assigning them to regular infantry duties. Countless trained marksmen were ordered to participate in trench raids, nighttime reconnaissance patrols, and routine defensive operations that required no specialized shooting skills whatsoever. They were put to work digging trenches, hauling supplies, and repairing barbed wire, tasks that could have been performed by any soldier. These assignments not only negated their extensive training, but also exposed them to the same indiscriminate dangers as the common infantrymen, risking the loss of a valuable asset for no tactical gain. Robert Graves, serving as an officer in the Royal Welch Fusiliers, documented numerous instances where his regimental commanders ordered their most qualified marksmen to participate in hazardous wire-cutting expeditions in the middle of no man's land. This reflected a complete failure to grasp that a trained sniper was an invaluable asset, difficult and time-consuming to replace. To risk his life on a task that any rifleman could perform was a shocking waste of a precious military resource. Yet it was a commonplace occurrence across the front. French military doctrine exhibited similar flaws, particularly during the early years of the war, when tactical thinking was still heavily influenced by pre-war theories about the supremacy of the offensive. French commanders, obsessed with mass infantry assaults, often deployed their snipers as part of the main attacking formations. These specialists were thrown into the meat grinder of frontal attacks against German positions, situations where their precision marksmanship skills provided absolutely no advantage and were utterly useless in the chaos of close-quarters combat. The bloody Champagne offensive of 1915, for example, saw numerous trained French snipers killed or wounded while participating in futile mass charges against German machine guns. They died as common foot soldiers, their unique capabilities completely nullified by a doctrine that had no place for individual precision in its grand, bloody calculus of mass assault. Even the German forces, who generally demonstrated a more sophisticated understanding of sniper employment, were not immune to such tactical errors. The systematic approach that defined their training did not always translate into appropriate deployment, especially when local commanders lacked a full appreciation of the sniper's role. German marksmen were sometimes assigned to simply hold static defensive positions that could have been adequately defended by regular infantry, wasting their offensive potential while needlessly exposing them to the ever-present threat of artillery bombardment. The poor positioning of sniper teams was another critical organizational failure that plagued all armies on the Western Front. Military commanders, who understood the theoretical importance of observation and precision fire, would often select firing positions for their snipers that looked tactically sound on a map, but proved to be suicidal in practice. These locations, chosen by officers who lacked any personal experience with telescopic sights or the realities of a counter-sniper duel, frequently offered poor fields of fire, inadequate concealment, or fatal exposure to enemy observation. A tragically common example was the placement of snipers in prominent, high structures like church towers, factory chimneys, or ruined buildings. To a commander in a rear area headquarters, these locations seemed perfect. They offered a commanding view of the enemy's territory. In reality, they were death traps. These elevated positions were the most obvious locations on the entire battlefield, and they were the very first place an enemy sniper would watch, or an enemy artillery observer would pre-register for bombardment. The tactical advantage of height was completely negated by the extreme vulnerability it created. A sniper placed in a church tower was isolated, easily spotted, and had no quick means of escape. Yet, commanders, clinging to outdated tactical principles, continued to deploy their marksmen in these locations throughout the war. The mounting casualties among snipers assigned to these ideal observation posts did little to change a mindset that valued a commanding view over the simple, life-saving principles of concealment. Communication breakdowns between snipers and their commanding officers created further tactical difficulties. Snipers, by virtue of their role, were among the best-informed soldiers on the battlefield. From their forward positions, they gathered an immense amount of valuable intelligence. They could observe enemy movement patterns, identify the locations of machine gun nests and command posts, and monitor defensive preparations. This detailed, real-time intelligence could have been invaluable for planning larger operations. However, the military communication systems of the era provided no effective method for a lone sniper to transmit this specialized information back to the staff officers who needed it. Field telephones were unreliable, and their wires were constantly being cut by shellfire, while sending a human runner was slow and incredibly dangerous. The unique, granular intelligence gathered by a sniper was often trapped with him at the front, unable to be passed up the chain of command in a timely manner. The rigid military hierarchies of the Great War created their own barriers. A sniper's report would typically have to pass through multiple levels of command, from his platoon leader to his company commander to battalion headquarters, and so on. By the time the information reached an intelligence officer with the authority to act on it, it was often hopelessly outdated or had been distorted and stripped of its vital details through repeated transmission. This was a systematic failure to exploit the full capability of the sniper. They were reduced to the role of simple triggermen when they could have served as the eyes and ears of the army. Their unique vantage point and patient observation skills made them natural intelligence-gathering assets. But the organizational structure was too inflexible and the communication technology too primitive to capitalize on this potential. Priceless information that could have saved lives was consistently lost in the bureaucratic and technological void. The training programs established to create these specialized soldiers often reflected the very organizational problems that plagued their deployment. Most armies eventually set up dedicated sniper schools, but these institutions frequently focused almost exclusively on pure marksmanship, while providing minimal instruction in the crucial arts of fieldcraft, camouflage, and tactical movement, the very skills that determined whether a marksman would survive his first week on the front line. The curriculum was often designed by officers who understood conventional military training but lacked practical, hard-won experience in the sniper's lonely war. The British sniper training programs, established at locations like Lingfield, were a prime example of this imbalance. They provided excellent instruction in the technical aspects of shooting, rifle maintenance, the use of telescopic sights, and the principles of ballistics. Graduates of these schools were undoubtedly superb shots. However, they received only the most rudimentary training in camouflage construction, route selection through hazardous terrain, and the advanced observation techniques that distinguished a truly effective sniper from a simple marksman. The result of this lopsided training was the creation of soldiers who were perfectly prepared for a peacetime target shooting competition, but dangerously unprepared for the lethal complexities of the Western Front. They could hit a small target at a known range under controlled conditions, but they lacked the deep well of knowledge in fieldcraft and survival that was essential for operating and enduring in a forward position. They knew how to shoot, but many did not know how to hide, how to move, or how to see without being seen. The short duration of most sniper training programs compounded these deficiencies. The British programs, for instance, typically lasted only 2 to 3 weeks. This was barely enough time to cover the basic principles of marksmanship, leaving almost no opportunity for the extended, practical field exercises necessary to develop genuine expertise in camouflage and stalking. German training programs, while generally longer and more comprehensive, still fell short of the months of intensive instruction that would have been needed to produce a truly proficient specialist, capable of surviving and thriving in the hostile ecosystem of no man's land. The very criteria used to select candidates for these schools was another dimension of organizational failure. In most armies, soldiers were chosen for sniper training based almost entirely on their peacetime marksmanship scores. While shooting ability was obviously a prerequisite, it was far from the most important trait for a combat sniper. A soldier who could shoot tight groups on a quiet rifle range often lacked the other, more critical attributes: immense patience, keen observational skills, and the unique psychological stability required for operating alone under constant mortal threat. Most critically, the concept of psychological screening for such a role simply did not exist during the First World War. Military medicine of the era provided no framework for assessing whether an individual soldier possessed the mental characteristics necessary for the job, the capacity for intense, prolonged concentration, the resilience to handle extreme isolation, and the fortitude to engage in the deeply personal act of killing at a distance. As a result, men were sent into this incredibly demanding role who, despite their shooting skills, lacked the fundamental psychological resilience to endure its unique and terrible pressures. Supply chain failures created yet another layer of systemic problems that constantly undermined the sniper's effectiveness. The specialized equipment that marksmen required, high-quality telescopic sights, precision ammunition, and effective camouflage materials, fell completely outside the standard logistical systems. These massive supply chains were designed to provide bulk commodities like rifles, rations, and millions of rounds of standard ammunition to large infantry formations. They were not built to handle the unique, small-scale needs of a handful of specialists in each battalion. The supply officers responsible for equipping the troops were experts at procuring and distributing standard-issue gear, but they often had little to no experience with the specialized requirements of a sniper. This logistical blind spot led to chronic shortages of the most essential materials. A sniper was a craftsman who depended on his specific tools, but all too often, he found that the military bureaucracy was incapable of providing them in a timely or consistent manner. Replacement telescopic sights were a particularly critical and persistent supply problem. The delicate optical instruments that snipers relied upon were incredibly vulnerable to the harsh realities of the front. They were easily damaged by the earth-shattering concussion of artillery, knocked out of alignment by a simple fall in the mud, or rendered useless by internal fogging. When these essential instruments failed, the sniper was, for all practical purposes, put out of action. Yet, acquiring a replacement was a bureaucratic nightmare. A sniper with a broken scope might have to wait for weeks, or even months, for a new one to make its way through the labyrinthine supply system from a area depot. During that time, a highly trained and valuable military asset was rendered effectively useless, unable to perform his specialized mission. The supply systems that could replace 1,000 standard rifles in a day proved utterly incapable of providing a single, specialized optical sight to the man who needed it most. Ammunition supply created similar frustrations, particularly for the armies that did develop specialized cartridges for precision shooting. German forces, for instance, produced limited quantities of exceptionally accurate ammunition specifically for sniper use. However, the logistical chain responsible for distributing it often broke down. This superior ammunition would get stuck in area dumps or diverted to other units, frequently failing to reach the forward positions where the snipers actually operated. This forced them to fall back on using standard infantry cartridges, negating the inherent accuracy of their finely tuned rifles. Beyond supply, the maintenance requirements for sniper equipment far exceeded the capabilities of the standard military armorers who supported regular infantry units. When a telescopic sight needed repair or a rifle needed to be precisely reserved, the specialized knowledge and delicate tools required for the job were rarely available at the unit level. A standard armorer could fix a jammed rifle, but he had no training in the fine art of servicing a complex and fragile optical instrument. This meant that when a sniper's rifle lost its accuracy due to rough handling or environmental exposure, a constant occurrence, it could not be properly fixed on the front line. The entire weapon system often had to be sent back to a specialized maintenance facility far behind the lines. This process could take weeks, leaving the sniper without his primary tool and his unit without its specialist. All because the maintenance infrastructure had not been designed to support the needs of this new and vital form of warfare. Personnel rotation policies created yet another problem that systematically undermined the long-term effectiveness of sniper operations. Military personnel systems, designed for the needs of a massive conventional army, emphasized the rapid rotation of soldiers through different assignments. The underlying theory was to provide broad experience and prevent the development of overspecialization, which might make a soldier difficult to replace. While this approach may have had some merit for regular infantry, it proved disastrous for a role that depended so heavily on accumulated expertise. An experienced sniper's greatest asset was not just his rifle, but his intimate, hard-won knowledge of his specific sector of the front. Over months of patient observation, he learned the subtle terrain features, the patterns of enemy activity, the routines of the soldiers in the opposing trench, and the unique environmental conditions of his area. This localized knowledge was invaluable and could not be taught in any training school. Yet, the military's rotation policies ensured that just as a sniper was becoming most effective, he was likely to be transferred. British sniper Harold Robinson, operating near Pastendal, documented this frustrating reality. After 6 months of continuous combat operations, during which he had developed a detailed, almost encyclopedic knowledge of the German positions and tactics in his sector, he was abruptly transferred to a training unit back in England. His replacement, though a graduate of the best sniper school and an excellent marksman, arrived on the front with no knowledge of the local conditions. He had to begin the dangerous and time-consuming process of learning the sector from scratch. When experienced snipers were transferred, all of their institutional knowledge was lost with them. The informal intelligence networks they had built with artillery observers and infantry patrols were shattered. The mental maps they had created of effective firing positions and safe movement routes were erased. This constant revolving door of personnel meant that sniper sections were always in a state of rebuilding their expertise, preventing them from ever reaching their full potential. The lessons of the front were constantly being learned anew at a high cost in blood, only to be discarded by bureaucratic policy. German forces generally demonstrated a better understanding of the importance of keeping experienced sniper teams together and in a specific sector for long periods. However, even their personnel system was not immune to decisions that treated these specialists as interchangeable assets. Experienced German marksmen were sometimes transferred to other assignments or commissioned as officers, a promotion that would remove them from their sniper role entirely, once again wasting their unique and hard-won expertise. On top of all this, the administrative burdens placed upon snipers by the military bureaucracy created a constant, low-level drain on their time and focus. Snipers were often required to maintain detailed written records of all their activities. This included logs of targets engaged, reports on ammunition expenditure, and narrative summaries of their daily operations. These administrative requirements, designed for conventional military units, where such record-keeping served a legitimate purpose, proved counterproductive for a role that demanded maximum focus on immediate tactical concerns. This paperwork not only consumed time that could have been better spent observing the enemy, but it also created a significant security risk. Detailed, written reports about sniper positions, tactics, and successful kills created a physical document that could fall into enemy hands through capture or espionage. This could provide the enemy with a perfect blueprint of Allied sniper operations in a given sector. The military bureaucracies that demanded these reports often lacked a fundamental understanding of the security implications that such documentation created for these highly sensitive, specialized operations. Integration problems between sniper units and the regular infantry formations they were meant to support created yet another layer of tactical difficulty. Infantry commanders, already overwhelmed with the immense challenges of managing their sector, often lacked a clear understanding of a sniper's specific needs and capabilities. This frequently led to a failure to coordinate their own operations with the marksmen operating in their area, resulting in tactical friction and dangerous conflicts over the use of terrain. Snipers, who relied on stealth and an undisturbed environment, would spend hours carefully moving into a concealed forward position, only to have their efforts completely undone by a noisy infantry patrol moving through the same area. Infantry commanders, focused on their own objectives, might view the specialist marksman not as a supporting asset, but as an interloper operating in their territory, leading to a lack of cooperation that was detrimental to both. The command relationships between snipers and regular military units remained poorly defined for much of the war, creating a state of constant confusion regarding operational authority and tactical responsibility. Did a sniper in a forward position take his orders from the local infantry captain who commanded that section of trench? Or did he report to a separate, specialized sniper officer at battalion headquarters? The answer was often unclear. This command ambiguity could create dangerous situations. A sniper might find himself caught between conflicting orders from two different commanders. A local infantry officer, perhaps desperate to eliminate a troublesome enemy machine gun, might order a sniper to take a risky shot that offered a low probability of success and a high probability of compromising the sniper's long-term observation post. This could directly conflict with the patient, methodical principles that governed a successful sniper's mission, forcing the marksman into an impossible choice. The sum of these organizational failures, from misuse and poor positioning to flawed training, broken supply chains, and a lack of integration, painted a grim picture. The sniper was a specialist, fighting not only the enemy, but his own army's bureaucracy and ignorance. The system was simply not designed to support him. If you appreciate this detailed approach to military history, we invite you once again to subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes so you don't miss our future explorations. The consequences of these systemic failures extended far beyond the immediate casualties suffered by individual marksmen. The institutional ignorance that governed their employment, combined with the systematic waste of their specialized skills, established patterns of neglect and misunderstanding that would haunt military organizations for decades after the armistice. The legacy of these forgotten marksmen became one of lost knowledge, unrecognized contributions, and repeated mistakes. The hard-won lessons of the Western Front's brutal school of precision killing were not learned but buried. This failure would ensure that the immense sacrifices of these soldiers would be repeated in future conflicts. As new generations of military leaders failed to learn from the experiences of those who had fought and died in the muddy fields of France and Belgium, the casualty rates among the snipers of the First World War reached staggering levels, effectively eliminating an entire generation of specialized knowledge before it could be properly documented or transmitted. The very nature of their work, isolated in extreme forward positions, and specifically targeted by the enemy, made their operational lifespan brutally short. With their deaths, the unique and invaluable lessons they had learned were lost forever, a quiet tragedy of squandered expertise. British records from the Imperial War Museum indicate that sniper casualties exceeded 60% in most units that maintained these specialists throughout the conflict. Some battalions lost their entire complement of trained marksmen during a single offensive operation. The 1st Battalion of the Leicestershire Regiment, for example, lost 7 of its 9 qualified snipers during the catastrophic first day of the Somme offensive, wiping out years of accumulated experience in a matter of hours. These were not just numbers. These men carried with them an immense body of hard-earned practical knowledge. They understood German counter-sniper tactics. They had perfected camouflage techniques through deadly trial and error, and they had developed mental ballistic tables for their rifles under the specific conditions of their sector. This was vital, life-saving information that existed only in their minds, and it was buried with them in the mud of no man's land. German sniper casualties, while generally lower due to their superior training, equipment, and doctrine, still reached levels that decimated their ranks of experienced specialists. As the war progressed, The increasingly effective and systematic counter-sniper campaigns conducted by Allied forces, particularly during 1917 and 1918, began to take a heavy toll. Many of the most experienced German marksmen, the very men who had developed the innovative tactics of the early war period, were systematically hunted down and eliminated. Fritz Müller, a German sniper credited with over 100 confirmed kills while operating near Verdun, was himself eliminated by French counter-sniper fire in March of 1918. He took with him to his grave an encyclopedic knowledge of Allied positions, routines, and vulnerabilities that had been accumulated over 3 years of continuous daily observation. This was a level of intelligence and experience that could never be replicated in a training manual. The direct result of this high attrition rate was that the brilliant tactical innovations and technical improvements developed by individual marksmen rarely survived long enough to be incorporated into formal military doctrine. A sniper would discover a new way to solve a deadly problem, use it to great effect, and then be killed before he had the chance to pass that knowledge on. The Army's institutional memory was effectively non-existent for this specialized craft. Imagine a British sniper, William Henderson, who developed an ingenious technique for using the geometry of artillery craters as concealed firing positions, creating hides that were virtually invisible to German observers. His method, involving a deep understanding of soil composition and drainage, was highly effective. But this technique was never documented or taught in any official training school, because Henderson was killed by a German shell fragment before he could train other marksmen in his life-saving methods. His innovation simply vanished. French snipers developed similar battlefield innovations that ultimately died with their creators. Jean-Baptiste Moreau, a marksman with the 147th Infantry Regiment, devised a highly effective system for coordinating his own observations with those of artillery spotters. His technique allowed French batteries to deliver incredibly accurate counter-battery fire against German gun positions, significantly reducing their effectiveness. The system proved its worth during the Champagne offensive, but it was never formally adopted because Moreau was killed during a German gas attack before he could fully document his procedures or train other personnel in their implementation. The profound psychological trauma experienced by the snipers who did survive created another dimension of lost knowledge. The intimate nature of their work, combined with the unique stress of being both a hunter and the hunted, inflicted deep mental wounds. British medical records from the period show that sniper veterans exhibited significantly higher rates of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. However, the primitive understanding of combat psychology at the time meant these symptoms were typically dismissed as shell shock, cowardice, or simple malingering. Harold Furness, the sniper, who had endured the rising waters of a shell hole on the Somme, returned to civilian life in 1919 a haunted man. He reported persistent nightmares involving the faces of the German soldiers he had killed, their expressions frozen forever in the circular lens of his scope. The military medical services provided no treatment for these symptoms, offering little more than platitudes and suggestions that he should try to put the war behind him. The very experiences that had made him an expert were the ones that now made his life unbearable. German sniper veterans faced the same psychological abyss and were met with the same institutional ignorance. Klaus Weber, who had served as a counter-sniper specialist, developed severe anxiety and depression after returning to his life in Munich. He suffered from hypervigilance and insomnia, with any unexpected sound triggering panic attacks that sent him back to the terror of the trenches. German medical authorities attributed his condition to general war neurosis, failing to recognize the specific and acute psychological toll of his specialized role. This failure to understand and treat the unique trauma of snipers meant that many survivors were unable to contribute their knowledge to post-war military development. Veterans who should have become the master instructors for the next generation, or who could have helped shape improved sniper doctrine, were often too psychologically damaged to effectively participate in military life. Their invaluable expertise remained locked away within minds that had been shattered by experiences the world was not yet ready to comprehend. Adding insult to injury, the post-war military establishments in Britain, France, and America largely dismissed the lessons that had been learned, influenced by new theories about mobile, mechanized warfare involving tanks and aircraft. Many military planners came to a fatally flawed conclusion that the sniper was a specialized product of static trench warfare, a role that would have limited application in the fast-moving conflicts of the future. The British Army's 1920 Field Service Regulations, a document that would shape its doctrine for years to come, barely mentioned sniper operations at all. Precision marksmanship was treated as a minor, almost trivial specialty that required minimal institutional support or doctrinal development. The hard-won knowledge of the past 4 years was simply cast aside in favor of new, unproven theories. American and French military planners reached almost identical conclusions, emphasizing the roles of artillery and massed infantry, while virtually ignoring the tactical impact snipers had demonstrated. They had become an inconvenient footnote in the history they had so profoundly, if quietly, shaped. This institutional dismissal of the sniper's craft meant that the vast majority of tactical innovations developed at such a high cost during the war were simply not incorporated into the training programs or equipment development of the interwar years. The effective camouflage techniques that had been perfected through deadly experience on the Western Front were forgotten, forcing the next generation of snipers to rediscover them from scratch. The sophisticated counter-sniper tactics developed by German specialists were not studied or integrated into Allied doctrine, leaving glaring vulnerabilities that would be exploited by enemy marksmen in subsequent conflicts. Equipment development suffered from a similar, systemic neglect. The advanced optical sights that had been forged in the crucible of the war represented a significant leap in technology. Yet post-war development efforts failed to build upon these improvements. British ordnance authorities allowed the specialized high-quality ammunition that had been developed for sniper use to be discontinued, forcing a return to standard-issue cartridges that lacked the consistency needed for precision shooting. The lessons paid for in blood were discarded for peacetime economy. The highly individual nature of sniper warfare also contributed to this institutional amnesia. The contributions of individual marksmen were rarely documented in a systematic way in official military records. The detailed unit histories of the war focused on the actions of large formations, battalions, brigades, and divisions. The quiet, vital work of a lone sniper eliminating a machine gun nest or a key enemy officer was typically relegated to a passing mention, if it was recorded at all. This lack of detailed documentation meant that the specific techniques, the ballistic calculations, and the tactical procedures that led to a successful engagement were lost to history. Future generations could read that a sniper had been effective, but they had no way of studying how he had achieved that success. This prevented the replication and improvement of effective tactics, ensuring that the wheel would have to be reinvented by every new generation of marksmen. This historical neglect created a dangerous void. Military leaders and planners preparing for future conflicts lacked access to the accurate information and detailed case studies that could have informed and improved doctrine. The shocking result was that many armies, including the American and British, entered the Second World War with arguably less institutional knowledge about the effective employment of snipers than they had possessed in 1918. They were forced to repeat many of the same costly mistakes that had been made a generation earlier. This tragic pattern of forgetting and rediscovering would continue. The hard-won lessons of urban sniping from the Korean War were largely lost by the time American forces deployed to Vietnam. The innovative techniques developed in the jungles of Southeast Asia were not systematically incorporated into the training programs for subsequent conflicts. In each new war, a new generation of snipers was forced to pay in blood for knowledge that should have been preserved and passed down through a living, institutional memory. The individual stories of the First World War snipers, their technical innovations, their tactical adaptations, and their immense personal sacrifices were lost to history, not through any deliberate act of suppression, but through the simple, tragic failure of military institutions to recognize their value. These forgotten marksmen had solved complex tactical problems under the most demanding conditions imaginable, yet their solutions died with them. The legacy of the World War I sniper is thus one of squandered potential and repeated tragedy. In failing to preserve and honor the knowledge of these men, military institutions ensured that their sacrifices would be repeated rather than remembered, their lessons lost rather than learned. They were the masters of a craft that their own armies never truly understood, and the price of that ignorance would be paid again and again on the battlefields of the future.